Welcome to the Unquendor Guitars workshop and another part in the video series where I show you very in depth how I make one of my guitars. But before I get started on this episode, in which I'm going to put the frets into the neck I've been working on, I'm very curious to know what brought you to my channel. Are you also building your own guitars? Are you thinking about building your own guitar and are you looking for information? Yeah, let me know in the comment section down below. And while you're there, please leave a like if you like these videos. So let's get started. What I'm going to show you in this video doesn't only apply to new guitars, but you can do the exact techniques I'm using on a refret job on an existing instrument as well. Fretting is not that difficult, to be honest, and it doesn't require a lot of specialized tools. The most important thing is that you have a good cutter and a fretting hammer, and a fretting hammer is essentially a hammer of which the hammerhead is a softer material than your fret wires. Otherwise, when you're going to hit the frets, you're going to dent it. That's something we want to avoid if possible. Yeah, and yeah, there are other bits and pieces coming to crowning and leveling. You need a leveling beam and maybe a crowning file and an end dressing file, but that's basically it. I'm going to start with cleaning out the fret slots using a feeler gauge, 0.4 mil feeler gauge. I customized, or I made a couple of little grooves in with my jeweler saw. I just made little grooves so I can clean out the fret slots really easy. And I have to recut the two fret slots where the dragon inlay is, and of course where my guide pins are when I glued up the fretboard. So that's what I'm going to do first. Clean out and recut the fret slots. To recut these two fret slots, I use a little trick with my jeweler saw, because you don't want to be cutting into aluminum with your good fret slotting saw. It will dull straight away. So what I do is I take my jeweler saw, put it in the fret slot, and very carefully start cutting. Lower the tension a bit, so I put just a little pressure on it. So I use the two edges of my fretboard as a guide for my jeweler saw. And I now just realized I have a very fine blade in it at the moment, but we'll get there. Right, and when I'm through with the jeweler saw, I use an old fretting saw to widen the cut a bit. And try not to scratch the inlay. Just be patient, be very careful. You don't want to widen the slot too much. Otherwise you get a fret that keeps popping out of the edge. There's one. Of course, measure it. I'm often quite scared. My fret slots aren't deep enough and I will have problems while inserting the fret wire. So I always double check and recheck to make sure that I don't run into any problems when putting in the fret wire. Nope. Need to recut this slot as well. That one's easy. Let's do the other one real quick, and I can see my battery has died, unfortunately. So after recutting the two fret slots in the inlay and the two where the guiding pins were, it is time to clean up all the fret slots. I use a feeler gauge and I modified it a bit. This one I barely use, and I don't know if it shows up on the camera, but I've added some grooves so it has a rougher edge to it, and this helps me to really clean out all the fret slots. So make sure they're all nice and clean. Let's start at one end and do them all. Alright, should be clean now. Brush. Next step is to use a triangular file and just lightly break the edges of your fret slot. And this not only helps with inserting the fret wire into your fret slot, but also when you need to do a refret job and you need to pull the frets out again, it will prevent to some extent tear out while removing the frets. Do yourself and the luthier that's going to work on your instrument in the future a pleasure. You just take a couple of minutes at a time to break these edges. And what I'm looking for is a nice and even bevel on both sides of the fret slot. Now the fretboard is all clean, nice, polished up, fret slots are clean. It's time to prepare our fret wire, and I'm going to use my little jig. One I made myself. It's very easy, just a couple of bearings with a washer in between, so my fret crown and my fret tang can run through it without damaging it, and I can adjust the top set of bearings with just a block that goes up and down. I can adjust it at the back. Just a quick little easy project. You can do this in a couple of hours. And you don't have to buy one online, it's very expensive. If you want to know more about this jig and if you want to see how I made this, let me know in the comment section down below. I can do a separate video on making this jig, because this is for me a prototype and I always wanted to make one out of a nice looking wood instead of just a piece of MDF. But although it's still a piece of MDF, it still works. Alright, to use this jig I usually clamp it in the vise on my workbench, but I'm going to try and show you it like this. You can adjust it so that fret wire barely goes in between. Tighten it up a little, and you can just run your fret wire through. You can just run your fret wire through the jig, and you don't need any fancy wheels or handles or anything. You can just pull it through until you're nearly at the end. Give it a couple of turns, just a quarter turn or an eighth of a turn. Run it through again, and now you can see the radius starting to form. And just repeat this. Until you're done, or you think you're done. And use some kind of measuring device to measure the radius. I'm not quite at 12 yet. Run it through again. So I'm almost at the end. Check it. Yeah, I'm there. And without doing any adjustments, I run it through one more time, because I know it's going to relax out a bit over the next couple of minutes. So I run it through again and I have a nice radiused fret wire. And to do the last one, readjust it. Put it in. Yeah, and rinse and repeat. So now with my fret wire radiused, it's time to hammer them in. And hopefully I can do it on this workbench. Let's protect the back of the neck a little. Yeah, there are a lot of different methods and opinions and who knows what on how to best insert your fret wire into your fret slots. Some say you must hammer them from the inside out, coming from both ways. Some are saying you should always use a press. Some say you should start hammering from the outside in and do them all in order. Actually, I don't know. I do it my way, and I haven't had any problems with it. So I stick to my ways. I do think pressing them in should give you a better result, but I don't have a press, so I'm forced to use a hammer. And the method I use is I insert my fret wire, tap them slightly in on both sides, and then start hammering them in towards the center of the neck. But I don't know if that's the best way. Probably not. Yeah, but it's just the way I do things. And yeah, if you think you have a better method, please let me know. And yeah, be sure to keep using that method if it works better for you. I don't like to cut all 24 frets beforehand. I just cut them as I go along, and it saves me a lot of fret wire. I can cut them almost to the correct size immediately, and it saves yeah, a lot of fret wire. So keep in mind that the end of your radiused fret wire is still straight. There's a little section the bearings couldn't get, and I always nip it off. It can give me problems if I keep my fret wire too short and the end is a straight section. So I look up the last bit that's still straight and I nip it off. And when nipping off fret wire, always have your cutter parallel to your fret tang. If you nip it sideways like this, you will crush your fret tang and it can't get into the slot. So always cut parallel to your fret tang, and it's too tiny to show on the camera, I'm sure. And what I do then is just measure out roughly the size I need, keep my thumbnail where I want to make the cut, cut it, and hammer it in. and I always cut off the axis straight away, so I can't hurt myself, and I still have good access with my cutters to the fret ends. And this is one fret in, 23 left to go. And as with all other jobs, just take your time. Although it seems like a rough process when hitting things with a hammer, it's still a delicate job. You want to make sure you get it touching and even with the fretboard as best as you can, and it requires some finesse, some practice. It's more than just hitting objects with a hammer, although it seems so at first glance. So yeah, I'll try and bring you somewhat closer so you can see better what I'm doing. I always hit the overhang of the fret a couple of times just to make sure it bends nicely over the corner. If there's any fret lift, it's usually at the edge of the fretboard, so I make sure it's grabbing on real tight at the two edges by just hitting the overhang. Also, the cutting action of your cutters sometimes compresses the edge of your fret somewhat, and it pulls it back out again. So always recheck. If that didn't happen, and it happened here. So that's why you have to make sure your cutters are as good as you can get them, nice and polished and as sharp as possible. And mine is a bit dulling out, and that's why I get the compression on the cutting edge. That might pull your fret out just a little. So next job to do is sharpen this after this fret job. Let's put this in the time lapse. So you might have noticed I didn't use any super glue to glue in the frets. And that's because I don't like any glue ending up on my nicely polished fretboard. I use a technique, and I believe it was used by PRS guitars. Maybe they still do it up until this day. I'm not quite sure. And that's, I'm going to drip in a very high viscosity super glue underneath my frets. There's just a tiny gap left underneath the frets, and I'm going to use a toothpick and just a couple of drops of super glue to gently drop in a drop of super glue in each of these these tiny spaces underneath the frets. And I keep doing it until I can see it's all filled up. Then I use some dust from the fretboard to fill in the gaps. I flip the neck around and do it again, but this is going to take a while. All it takes is just toothpick, some super glue and a lot of time. So let's speed up this part of the process. So as soon as most of them are filled up, it's time to add some dust. Just sprinkle some dust. And now all we have to do is sand it, and we're ready to do some leveling and crowning. So now that the glue is applied and all the gaps are filled in, it's time to file down the fret ends. They're now nasty and sharp. And I use a couple of tools, and I start with this fret end dressing file. And I'm just going to run it along the edge of the frets to file them flush with the side of the fretboard. If you don't have one of these specialized tools, you can use an ordinary file or sandpaper or whatever to file down the fret ends. This just makes the job a bit easier. And to really clean it up, I'm going to use my leveling beams. And starting with 120 grit sandpaper. And be very careful not to hit your headstock. .120, and then I switch over to 240 grit and 380 to finish it off. And now we have a nice and clean fretboard. I hope you can see it on camera. All the gaps are nicely filled in. They're barely even noticeable. And before I go over to level and dress the frets, I'm going to put in the side dots, because that also requires some super glue and some sanding. So yeah, let's put in some side dots. And I always use, where is it? Here it is. As with everything on my guitars, I'm going to use aluminum. It's just aluminum wire. It's 2 mils thick for my side dots. So of course first I have to determine the position of the side dots. I have to mark them out, drill some holes and put in some side dots. So now they're all marked out, and use an awl to indicate where the hole is going to be. Now it's time to get out a small drill bit and put in the side dots. Before I drill any holes, I always check the dimensions. Yeah, it's still 2 mil, just to be safe. Cordless drill. And a 2 mil drill bit. Scary stuff. And I'm going to secure the neck to the bench. I don't want it to move while I'm drilling these side holes. Low speed and some confidence. And of course we're going to use our trusty friend super glue, toothpick, little drop super glue. Press it in a little, snip it, and then hammer it in. And then let it sit for a while. I might have used a bit too much super glue in that one. So. Use a little less. I love to use this aluminum for side dots. That's because when you hit it, it slightly expands, so you get a nice fitting side dot. And it isn't plastic. And to be honest, it's very cheap as well. And when the glue has dried or is set, we can use the fret and dressing file again. And the leveling beams. And in my opinion, these are some nice looking side dots. Although the method I used for applying the glue underneath the frets took some more time initially, and now it saves me a lot of time because my fretboard is still nice and clean, and I don't have to spend any time on removing those pesky squeeze outs and drops and marks that you can have when applying the glue to the frets while installing the frets. So yeah, it depends where you spend your time. I don't like to spend my time cleaning up stuff, so I now still have a nice clean fretboard, and when I look at my frets, there's no glue sticking out anywhere underneath it or peeking through. So yeah, it takes some more time to apply the glue, but the end result is what counts, and I think it gives a fantastic result. And of course, some nice side dots are in, and now it's time to level and dress the frets. Starting with making sure, again, the fretboard is absolutely dead straight. But first, some coffee. Before doing any work to the frets themselves, I have to make sure my neck is as straight as possible, and I'm going to need a specialized tool to do it. It's a notched straight edge. It's basically a straight edge with notches cut into it that fall over the fret, so I can check if my neck is nice and straight. I'm not taking the frets into account because I know they're not level at the moment. Yeah, and as I expected, there's a bit of a bow. Now I can just adjust the truss rod to get rid of the bow. So, nice and straight. It didn't take much at all, just a quarter turn. So now my neck is ready to start working on the frets, and I'm going to start with beveling the sides of the frets. They're now nasty and sharp, so I'm going to put approximately a 30-degree bevel on the side of the frets, and of course I'm going to use my sanding beams to do that. Just put your sanding beam at an angle. I also take this opportunity to break the edge, the sharp edge we left on the fretboard itself. This is a job I don't want to rush. I take my time because this, I think, makes a huge difference in the quality of a guitar. Is usually determined by the player, by the feel of the neck and the frets. So yeah, I really feel that doing a great job on the neck and on your frets makes all the difference. This is, of course, the user interface. This is what players touch all the time, and yeah, you really want to make sure your neck feels good. At this point, I see more sawdust appearing in comparison to dust from the frets, so I know I'm hitting the edge of my fretboard, and it's starting to feel less sharp and almost rounded over. So at this point, the sides of the frets are ready, and it's time to start leveling. But first I have to mask off the fretboard to prevent any damage done to it. So yeah, let me mask off my fretboard. I almost forgot, before I can mask off the fretboard, I need to round over the corners of the frets. I have to knock them off using a little file. This is a fret end dressing file. It has a rounded over edge and a very sharp edge, or a very flat edge, and I can use this flat side of the file to rest on my fretboard and just knock off these sharp corners. And I have to do this before the masking tape goes on, otherwise I can't reach into the utmost corner of the fret end. So you can just round it over. Until it's nice and smooth and there's no nasty sharp edge anymore. Of course, after leveling, I'm going to round over the entire fret end. I like to make some bullet shape edges to my frets instead of leaving them like this. But I have to first knock off all these corners. I've got this one. So there are 24 frets times 4 corners. It's 96 corners to treat. So yeah, let me speed things up. yeah, it isn't entirely necessary to do it like I do. If you just knock off all the sharp edges with your file, you can be done much quicker. But yeah, I think every minute you spend on it is a minute well spent and well worth it into the quality of the neck. It's just, yeah, in my opinion, it just makes a difference. So now with the fret ends nice and smooth, or not sharp anymore, now I can finally start masking off the fretboard and start leveling the frets, re-crown them, and then really nicely dress up the fret ends. The fretboard is all masked, and I just noticed before I can start leveling I have to replace the sandpaper on my leveling beam again. I'm going to use a 240 grit and a 320 grit sandpaper. You don't need any coarser sandpaper to level the frets in my experience. So I'll be right back and show you how I level the frets. So I replaced the sandpaper on one of my leveling beams, and for some reason I like to use a shorter leveling beam. I don't know why. I just do. So before I can start leveling, I am going to use a permanent marker to mark all the frets. You can use a permanent marker or a Sharpie or whatever. So now I've marked all the tops of all the frets, and I can use my leveling beam and just let it rest on your frets. Drag it across and keep the leveling beam parallel to the center line of your neck as much as possible. Now the sandpaper has removed the marker from the tops of the high frets, and where the fret is lower than its two neighbors, the sandpaper won't hit it, so the mark will remain there. Yeah, and I'm going to continue this process until all the marks are gone. Then I'm going to check if my frets are indeed all nice and level. So most of the marks are now gone, and I'm going to mark them out again and go over it again with a finer sandpaper at 320 grit this time. To check if I've done a good job, I'm going to use what's called a fret rocker to check all frets if they're level to their two neighbors. And you do this by placing on your fret rocker and trying to tip it back and forth. And if there's no play at all, so there's no rock, it means at least these two frets are at the same height, and the one in the middle isn't higher than his two neighbors, otherwise it can rock. And of course that will cause some fret buzz. And don't check it just in the center, check it over the entire width of the neck and keep the fret rocker parallel to the center line. Got a little bit of rock here, and that means that the end of this fret is still a bit high compared to its two neighbors. So I'm going to mark out just the section. Yeah, it's only at a single spot, so I can use a little file to just spot level it until it's correct. So we can just take a little file, a couple of strokes. Right, now it's good. And of course, keep doing this for all the frets. Now with the frets nice and level, I like to put in a bit of what's called, I believe, a relief in the last couple of frets. So from, let's say, 16 up until 24. And what I mean by that, I'm going to file them down or send them down ever so slightly at an angle. And that allows for a lower action to be set when the guitar is ready. So you don't get any fret buzz when playing at these higher positions with an extremely low action. To do that, it's very easy, very simple. I'm going to put 3 pieces of masking tape over the 12th fret. I'm going to use 3 pieces because this is very thin masking tape. I would recommend when you use a regular masking tape to only use 2. I'm going to remark the frets up until the 15th fret. So that's 15. Yeah. And I'm going to mask off one side or a part of my leveling beam. And I need to cut it. I have to make sure. So one side is now basically useless, and I can let this ride on the masking tape on the 12th fret, and this gives me just a slight angle to level the last couple of frets, and then it's just repeating like we did. Put on the leveling beam. Give it 1 stroke, back, again. Now of course you'll notice the 24th and the 23rd fret, the markings are going to disappear first, and then the 22nd, 21st, etc. And I'm going to repeat it until I'm barely touching the 15th fret, so I barely can see the marking start to disappear. And then I know I'm done. I'm going to recheck it with the fret rocker. And then I should be ready to start crowning and polishing the frets. Now, after leveling, my frets look something like this. And I hope this shows up on camera, but the top is all flat, caused by the leveling beam, of course. And to round them over again, I'm going to do something that's called re-crown them, crowning the frets, so they get a nice and rounded top again. To re-crown your frets, you're going to need a re-crowning file or a crowning file. You can buy specialized files that have a hollow in them. You can just pass them over your fret until you got your crown back. The downside from these files is you can't see what you're doing because your work is taken out of view from the file itself, so you can't really see what you're doing. I personally use another type of recrowning file or a crowning file, and this basically is just a regular triangular file, but all the edges are ground off and highly polished so they won't damage your fretboard when you run them over your fretboard. And now the trick is, and I like to sit down for this because I like to concentrate, and I can concentrate a lot better when I'm sitting down. You can remark all your frets, so put another mark on them, and you can run them across the frets, along the fret, and with every pass you're going to turn it ever so slightly, and then you're going to remove a piece of the mark you made with every pass, and you should end up with a nicely rounded fret crown. And the trick is to leave the smallest amount of mark in the dead center of your fret. I always compare it with using an eraser with pencil, where you can use your eraser to gradually thin out a line, and that's the same thing you're doing here. There's in my case, a big blue line on the top of my fret, and I'm going to use the recrowning file to gently erase this line until I've got just the tiniest line possible left over, and I'm going to do it for all the frets. So let's get started. And when using this, one last tip, keep in mind your fretboard has a radius, so don't keep your recrowning file level, but let it move along with the radius of your fretboard. And you should be able to thin down the line on top of your fret with each pass the same amount over the entire length of the fret. And as you can imagine, it takes time. The more you do it, the faster you get. Once again, another job. I don't like rushing. I just sit down. Usually I put some music on and just focus on doing this right. Okay, the frets are recrowned, or almost. They have a rough shape. I don't know if it shows up on the camera. Let's try it again. But there are just very tiny hairlines visible from the marker. And now it's time to give them the final shape. I'm going back to my friend, the fret end dressing file. The fret end dressing file. It's difficult to say. And start rounding over the edges, and this time, instead of using the flat side of my end dressing file, I'm going to use the rounded side of the file to guide along my fretboard, so I don't damage the fretboard. Although it's taped off, still a bit of a sharp edge on the flat side, and I don't have it on the rounded side, the polished rounded side. So now I can use this to round over the final edges. And then I'm going to use sandpaper, starting I think at 400 grit up until 2000, 2500, to really polish and fine shape these frets. So I hope you can see it. So I've got my fret end. So my fret end dressing file, it is a polished rounded side. I'm going to use this to guide along the fret, and at the end round it over. So, and I keep doing this until I've got a nice bullet shaped or dome shaped fret end, and I don't know if it shows up on camera or not, but I get a really nice dome shaped fret end with no sharp edges at all. Again, not really necessary. The only thing you should do is just give it a couple of passes just to knock off this sharp edge at the top of the fret. Usually that's enough, but I like to take it a step further and really round it over. So yeah, that's one down, 47 to go. After rounding over all the fret ends, another really smooth, I'm going to use different grades of sandpaper, starting with 400 grit and up to 2500, 2500 grit. I'm going to fine sand all the frets, but still leaving the tiny mark in the center alone. I don't want to touch it at all. As long as these lines are here, that means all the frets are still level, and only with the final passes of the finest grit sandpaper I'm going to remove these final scratches and final marks. Be very careful not to sand through your masking tape, so don't apply too much pressure. It isn't necessary to apply any pressure at all. Just run your sandpaper back and forth on your fret. Press the ends a bit, make them all nice. Unfortunately, during the fine sanding of the fret, I didn't notice my camera had died. So essentially I've been talking to no one in particular for the past hour. But I've done fine sanding all the frets. I started with 400 grit sandpaper, then switched over to 600, 800, 1000, 1500, and I ended up with 2000 grit polishing sandpaper to really get a nice polished frets. And I left the tops of the frets alone until the 1500 grit sandpaper, and then I started gently removing the scratches from the leveling until I can only barely notice them. And of course with the 2000 grit I finished them off, and now you can barely even see tiny marks from leveling, and I always keep them just ever so slightly visible, so I know all my frets are still level. As soon as those leveling marks disappear, I can't see if the frets are still level, and if you polish it too hard, you might end up with a fret that's lower than the others. So that's something to keep in mind while fine sanding and polishing your frets. Make sure you keep a mark, the mark we made with a permanent marker, or the tiny scratches left from leveling, to keep them visible as long as you can, just to make sure your frets are still nice and level. So now it's time for the final polishing. And you can use different methods to polish your frets. You can use a Dremel with a polishing compound, or maybe a big buffing wheel. I don't have a big buffing wheel, and I think it's a bit of a hassle to use the Dremel, so I like to put in some manual labor, and I'm using these fret polishing rubbers. They're like pencil erasers, only there's a fine abrasive in them, and I've got three types. I've got a medium coarse one, a fine one, and a super fine one. And these three stages help me to really polish up my frets, and that's what I'm going to do now. And of course I have to remask the entire fretboard, or maybe I just use strips so I don't damage the fretboard and don't leave any marks left by these polishing rubbers. So let's get to it. I start with the medium grit polishing rubber, and just keep on going back and forth until my fret is nice and shiny. Then I'm going to switch to the fine one. Don't forget to polish your fret ends, of course. Until it's even more shiny, and the fine one, of the super fine one. And now we have a very shiny fret. And let's do this 23 more times to the other frets. Last one done. And this is probably the shiniest these frets are ever going to be, because as soon as you touch them, most of the shine is already gone, but polishing them out really helps in the playability of a guitar. Oh, look at that. Amazing. So now I ended up with a very nice fret job, nice polished frets, smooth fret ends, rounded over fretboard edge, yeah, real comfortable neck already. Yeah, and a job like polishing your frets can be done on any guitar, and I think it's a good idea the next time you change your strings on your guitar, make sure you have some of these polishing rubbers at hand, and just give your frets a good polish, and you'll notice a big improvement in playability. Also on the cheaper guitars, on the cheaper end, just invest in a fret end dressing file and some of these polishing rubbers, and just knock off the corners, round over your fret ends, polish them, and you have a much better playing guitar, I'm sure of it. So now that our neck is mostly done and the hard part of guitar building is over, at least in my opinion, I think that making a neck is the hard part. It's time to do some fun stuff. In next episode I'll be working on the body. Yeah, in my opinion that's the fun part of guitar building. Although I don't mind making necks at all, of course. So yeah, keep an eye out for the next episode. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed this one. Leave a comment and a like in the comment section down below if you did, or if you have any questions, of course. And I hope to see you in the next episode. But until then, have a nice week.